thanks for that introduction, and thanks to PSI for all the excellent work they're doing around this issue and around defending public services as well. As Daria mentioned, we're working with the Transnational Institute and PSI on the whole trend and phenomenon of remunicipalisation, and as part of that, one of the really great things that's happened recently is we got some money from the European Research Council to fund a 5-year research project on the whole trend of global remunicipalisation. So I'll talk to that today in the short time I have available, going over a few trends and perhaps a few reflections or interpretations. Okay, so just looking for my PowerPoint here. Seems to have disappeared. Okay, is that on the screen now for everybody?
Yes, we see it now.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So as I said, we're basically we've got this 5-year project which is trying to unpack global remunicipalisation as a trend. Now, I think Daria's already very well defined it as a trend at the local level for local authorities, local governments to take back from privatisation key, vital, essential services back into forms of local, municipal and public ownership. Just to put it in context, though, very briefly, it's worth saying that privatisation is kind of basically been called into question all around the world, but it's important to emphasise that the broader neoliberal project of which that is part is not defeated yet. As most of you will know, there are still calls to privatise basic services going on around the world, and as you can see from the graph that I put up here, there are continuing trends to privatise, although these tend to be uneven over time and space. But I think what they signal is there is a continuing neoliberal project, if you like, to kind of push more and more public services into forms of private ownership. Now, against that, of course, there's also a growing realisation amongst a lot of people around the world that privatisation is failing. And we also see a kind of countervailing trend for the return of the state, the return of government intervention around the world. The COVID pandemic has perhaps brought these issues to the fore even more so. But I think the key thing to note here is that there is still political elite support for privatisation, neoliberalisation and marketized solutions, even as these things and their failures become more and more evident. So a key issue for us as those who believe in decent, affordable and also publicly run services is to kind of develop a counter narrative to some of this continuing elite narrative around privatization and marketization. And I think it's quite interesting in the UK, more recently in other parts of the world, we are beginning to hear the discourse changing about the role of perhaps the return of the public sector into the provision of vital public services. Now, I mentioned, and I think Daria mentioned, that remunicipalisation is a growing trend at the local level, but it's worth saying that it's part of a broader trend of deprivatisation that's happening at all geographical scales. And one of the things we've done in our research is this is with the amazing work of the Transnational Institute that some time ago began compiling from their networks around the world evidence of deprivatisation and remunicipalisation cases. We've begun to compile a database. In fact, we've now got a up and running public futures database, which catalogues very well, I think, the trend of deprivatisation that's been ongoing since 2000. And you can see from the graph that I put up there that this was very much a developing trend up until the late 2010s. So that by the time that we get into the present day, there's been a bit of a tailing off recently, but we are becoming aware of more and more cases that are coming into our purview. Even in the current period, we've been aware that there are something like over 1,500 cases of deprivatisation that have happened since 2000, and this is a remarkable trend, I think, going on against all the prevailing dominant global policy trends and pushes towards privatization, that we are seeing this almost under the surface trend of deprivatization going on around the world. Now, it is a global trend. I think that's the first thing to say. And we can talk about deprivatization processes happening on every continent in the globe, every part of the world. So as I say, we've been cataloging this increasingly with our public features database, which, thanks to the work of Satoko and colleagues at the TNI, and also a team at the University of Glasgow, is becoming an increasingly complex and sophisticated database. So I would recommend you to have a look there and to add new cases if you know of them when they come up in your region or in your country. But it is a significant global trend around the world. And as you can see from the two maps that I put up here, the epicenter of this trend tends to be in the global north, particularly in Europe, which has the vast majority of cases. But there are also significant trends in the US. And in the global south, I think there's been quite a big trend for deprivatization and remunicipalisation in South America as well. It's worth saying that there are also key national epicenters. If you look at the map of Europe, the second map here down towards the bottom right of the chart, and Germany in particular, as many of you will know, has been a key epicenter for deprivatization, remunicipalisation, particularly in the energy sector, which has been driven by the politics of the Energiewende. But other key epicenters are France, where water remunicipalizations have been a big trend. And increasingly, we're seeing some interesting trends in Spain and in the UK, where the deprivatization, remunicipalisation trend is somewhat newer, but nevertheless has seemed to have taken off in both countries since 2010. I'd also point you here briefly to some other key resources. A very good publication that was put together by TNI about the remunicipalisation trend and various case studies in a book in 2020. We also have a number of other resources on the PSI website and TNI websites, and also our University of Glasgow website too has lots of material and information about the trend. If we break that trend down, as I say, it's a key global trend. If we break it down by sector, you can see that energy and water, if you look at the pie chart here, energy and water have been the dominant sectors by far. Those are the sectors perhaps where privatization's failings have become most acute, if you like, and most evident to local users and customers, and where the demands for things to be taken back into public ownership have grown most strongly. But as you will see from the rest of the pie chart, it is a developing trend that's happening right across different sectors and right across the public services. As I mentioned, energy has been very dominant, largely because of the massive number of remunicipalizations that have occurred in Germany since 2000. That was a big trend, which is coming to an end, I think, now from about 2000 to 2015. Water cases, as I say, centered particularly in France and the US. But another, we're seeing a proliferation of sectors, a growing diversity of remunicipalizations happening since 2010 in everything from healthcare to kindergartens to local government insourcing. And an interesting trend in the US is the growth of local telecommunication public enterprises, which basically signals the massive failure of marketized and privatized forms of provision in the US in the telecom sector. And we're seeing some quite interesting emerging sectors too in housing, food, and criminal justice, for example, as well. Now, as I mentioned, we do see this wider trend of deprivatization happening across the world. But if you look at the breakdown in terms of where and how deprivatization is happening, remunicipalisation is very much the key dominant trend. In other words, it's the local taking back of public ownership and services that's dominant. And if you look at the chart that we've put up here, you can see there's a breakdown in terms of deprivatization into what we call remunicipalisation, which accounts for almost 2/3 of cases. We also have come up with the term municipalisation, which refers to cases where new public forms of ownership have been set up, new enterprises have been set up through local government, And then there's a smaller trend of renationalisation, which is still quite important. In the UK, for example, there have been some massive failures in the rail industry and sector in recent years, and that has led to a number of privatised rail companies being renationalised by a Conservative government, if you can believe it, which perhaps signals the kind of massive manifest failure of privatisation. The other thing I would say here, though, is I think what's quite interesting about this chart is that we're seeing very interesting different forms of ownership emerging through this process. And in particular, I'd point to the extent to which in some cases we're seeing local authorities, local governments collaborating with cooperative and community forms of ownership to create some quite new innovations, if you like, in democratic and citizen and worker participation in public ownership as well. If we look at the organisational scale at which these remunicipalizations are taking place, we find that, again, the vast majority of them tend to be within single local governments and local authorities. But the other interesting thing I think that's happening out of this process is a growing number of collaborations between local authorities and local governments in terms of creating inter-municipal enterprises. And I think that's partly due to the effects of austerity, where a lot of local authorities and governments don't feel they have the capacity anymore to run public services on their own. But it's also to do with perhaps realizing economies of scale by collaborating and getting together with other local authorities to, if you like, develop a strong response and a sort of counter movement to privatization and private forms of ownership. We've looked at some of the motivations behind remunicipalisation, and I just touched on these very briefly. But I think the overall trend that we find is that when you ask people and you begin to discuss why this is happening, it is the failings of privatisation to provide the things that were promised by elite proponents of neoliberal policies. In particular, privatisation didn't deliver the cost reductions and efficiencies that it was supposed to, and it didn't provide the improvements in investment and modernisation that were behind a lot of the sort of World Bank, IMF justifications for privatisation in the 1980s and 1990s. So it's those key failings, as you see from our slide there, that are really behind the remunicipalisation trend. Other motivations that have come out of our work have been the desire for public authorities, for workers, for citizens to take vital services back under public ownership and even democratic ownership and control, and also wider policy objectives such as using public services to meet broader public goods and public concerns. We also see a real motivation to improve the working conditions of those working in privatized sectors, which the usual experience is they deteriorate after privatization. And another interesting trend is this growing kind of focus by local politicians on bringing back vital public assets and public revenue generating sectors like energy, for example, into public hands so that the benefits of those sectors can be shared more and dispersed locally in broader community wealth building initiatives. So I mentioned the database. The other primary research kind of gathering exercise that we've been undertaking in our project is an online survey of remunicipalisation, which is attempting to get much more qualitative, deeper intensive information on what's going on. I'm just offering you up some basic evidence and some initial evidence from our online survey, which actually is revealing some quite interesting trends. So the first trend I think that's worth pointing out is that evidence of where remunicipalisation has already happened suggests that it is indeed improving the transparency, the efficiency, and the performance of organisations. I won't read out these quotes here. These are quotes from people who've responded to our survey, but they point to the kind of corruptions and the inefficiencies of privatisation on the one hand, and then when things are reversed, they point to the extent to which the effectiveness of public services improved, very often because it brings back workers, users, and public authorities back into integrated enterprises that have the capacity to deal with problems as they arise. So you can see this leads to responses, and we've still got quite a small survey. So I would encourage people who've been involved in remunicipalizations to fill in the survey when they can, or if they can point it to new people to fill in. But we can see that the overall effects seem to be generally pretty positive when people ask about how remunicipalisation has affected public services. It seems to have improved the effectiveness of public services more broadly. If you look at the outcomes for workers, again, whilst the overall picture isn't a massive shift away from the status quo, if you look at the kind of evidence that's emerging, a significant number of remunicipalizations do end up with very positive outcomes for workers in terms of the kind of overall employment relations environment, as the slide suggests. And I think the other interesting initial finding that we are finding from what is still a very small sample is that the relations between workers and users also improve through remunicipalisation processes. So I think these are quite important trends that we can point to. To finish up with, I think some critical reflections on all this, and this is very much a snapshot. There is a broader report that I'm working on, which we'll share with affiliates once we've done that in the next few weeks. But I think the important thing to say is that the work we're doing is very important because there is this blind spot in elite and many government actors about deprivatisation actually happening in the first place. It's barely acknowledged by the IMF, the OECD, and the EU. So we're effectively compiling our own database and our own data set from the grassroots upwards to challenge some of the official narratives and the official discourses of elite actors. I think the COVID pandemic, as Daria said at the beginning, is very much reinforcing the need for local integrated public ownership and management. It's quite evident that those countries that still have that are doing best in combating the pandemic. Those that don't have that and perhaps have much more marketized services and systems are actually perhaps seeing the worst effects. A third point perhaps is that climate change is kind of driving people to realize that there are limits to markets and private capital in really tackling the climate emergency, and we need public agency, especially at the local level. And I think politically, remunicipalisation is perhaps reflective of a broader moment, a broader change in the global political economy, a shift, perhaps a growing realization that we're facing numerous crises, and that we need perhaps in that space, in that moment, to argue for democratic public alternatives that go beyond business as usual solutions. And finally, I'd re-emphasize the importance of the work that we're doing here with TNI, PSI around our global database, but particularly with the online survey that we're doing, because I think that the kind of material and the evidence that you've just seen that's coming out is really important in allowing us to develop a broad and robust set of data for which we can combat elite narratives. So I want to thank everybody who's already contributed to this online survey. But for those who haven't, or those who know of people who could contribute cases to the survey that have been involved in remunicipalisation campaigns, I'd encourage you to go to our website that I put up here to carry out the survey. It shouldn't take long. The survey's available in, as you say, in all these different languages. And I can't emphasize enough how much of a vital weapon the research we're doing is in both giving us the information about what's happening on the ground, but also combating the kind of continuing elite narratives around marketization, privatization, and neoliberalism that haven't gone away. They're on the back foot, and we can take them on and we can mobilize to defeat them, but we need the evidence, the information to continue doing that. So I've probably gone over my time, Daria, so I shall finish there. I'm available for questions in the rest of the day. Thank you very much.